No, sir, I do not hold a security clearance, and so I would not have received any classified information.
Who does hold a security clearance? I'll just go to the second email here. I'm just curious about this. What I propose is that 30 days out from the election, this is another email to you from Mr. Chan. 30 days, we get temporary clearances. You pick who they are. Who were the people at Twitter who had a security clearance?
To be honest, sir, I'm not sure, and we never ultimately followed through on this plan to get temporary clearances.
Did anyone at Twitter have a security clearance?
It's my understanding that at least some current or former employees did hold clearances, but I wasn't certain about that.
Ms. Gaddy, do you know if anyone took up Mr. Chan's offer to hand out security clearances 30 days before the 2020 election?
Not that I'm aware.
So we don't know how many people had security clearances. Twitter, do we know? Mr. Baker, Mr. Gaddy, Ms. Gaddy, anyone know how many people on Twitter had a security clearance in the 30 days prior to the election?
I don't know the answer to that question,
Ms.
sir.
Gaddy?
I do not know.
Mr. Roth, you don't know?
No, sir.
Well, how about the last one? Ms. Navaroli, do you know?
No.
I mean, it seemed like the offer was to sort of just hand them out like candy. I just wondered who had them. No one knows? Okay. So the FBI didn't tell you that it was fake, didn't tell you that it was hacked. And Mr. Roth, did the story violate your policies?
In my judgment at the time, no, it did not.
Yeah, that's what you said. Said what I would propose, is you said it isn't clearly a violation of our hack materials policy, nor is it clearly a violation of anything else. So I think what a lot of people are wondering is if it didn't violate your policies and they didn't tell you it was fake, didn't tell you it was hacked, why'd you take it down?
The company made a decision that found that it did violate the policy. It wasn't my personal judgment at the time that it did, but the decision was communicated to me by my direct supervisor, and ultimately, I didn't disagree with it enough to object to
You know what I think happened, Mr. Roth? I think you guys got played. I think you guys wanted to take it deep down. We saw what the chairman put up where you said, everyone in the White House is a fascist. I think you guys wanted it to be taken down. I think you meet with these guys every week. We know that's been established in the Twitter files. You had weekly meetings with Mr. Chan in the run-up to the election. They send you all kinds of emails. They send you documents on the super secret James Bond teleporter. You get information on that. I think you guys wanted to take it down. I think you guys got played by the FBI. And that's the scary part. Because we had 50, this to me is the real takeaway. 51 former intelligence officials 5 days after you guys take down the Hunter Biden story and block the New York Post account. 5 days later, 51 former intel officials send a letter and they say, the Hunter Biden story has all the classic earmarks of a Russian information operation. The information operation was run on you guys. And then by extension, run on the American people. And that's the concern. And to Mr. Raskin's point that you guys aren't bound by the First Amendment because you're a private company, okay, maybe so. But your terms of service don't have to comply with the First Amendment. Would that be right, Mr. Roth? They don't have to. You've said that as much in your testimony.
My understanding of the First Amendment is that it protects people and businesses from government, not forms how the...
In your terms of service. So here's what I want to know. Here's what I want to know. Is this a violation of the First Amendment when the government, Mr. Chan, again, sending you an email saying, we think these accounts need to be looked at because they violate your terms of service? That's a different standard. So you got the government saying your terms of service, which don't have to comply with the First Amendment, but the government saying we don't think these accounts comply with your terms of service, please take them down. You see a problem there, Mr. Roth?
Mr. Chairman, I'm seeing a flashing red light. I'm happy to answer the question. Do I think that that's a valuable use of the FBI's time? No, but I don't see in a request for review a problem under the First Amendment, no.
I sure do. I thank the gentleman. I yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. Conley for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Very good.
My, what happens when you hold a hearing and you can't prove your point? We heard from the chairman in his opening statement that it's wrong for government to call Twitter and say, take down a tweet. Did I hear that correct, Mr. Roth?
That was my understanding, yes.
Yeah. So on May 27th, 2020, President Donald J. Trump tweeted, and I quote, Republicans feel that social media platforms totally silence conservatives. By the way, something that would come as news to you, apparently, Mr. Roth, because you're still the subject of conservative harassment. We will strongly regulate, he went on to say, or close them down before we ever allow this to happen, unquote. Ms. Navaroli, doesn't that sound eerily like a government official telling Twitter that there's a threat, we'll shut you down if we don't like the content?
I am not familiar with the tweet that you have referenced.
Well, but if I just told you that quote without telling you who said it, might it have some ominous overtones from your point of view if you're still at Twitter? We'll shut you down. We'll regulate you. We will never allow this to happen. Those are pretty strong words.
They are.
Yeah. Okay. On September 8th, 2019, at 11:11 p.m., Donald Trump heckled two celebrities on Twitter, John Legend and his wife, Chrissy Teigen, and referred to them as the musician John Legend and his filthy-mouthed wife, unquote. Ms. Teigen responded to that email at 12:17 a.m., and according to notes from a conversation with you, Ms. Navaroli's counsel, your counsel, the White House almost immediately thereafter contacted Twitter to demand the tweet be taken down. Is that accurate?
Thank you for the question. In my role, I was not responsible for receiving any sort of request from the government. However, what I was privy to was my supervisors letting us know that we had received something along those lines or something of a request. In that particular instance, I do remember hearing that we had received a request from the White House to make sure that we evaluated this tweet and that they wanted it to come down because it was a derogatory statement directed towards the
They
president.
wanted it to come down. They made that request.
To my recollection, yes.
I thought that was an inappropriate action by a government official, let alone the White House. But it wasn't Joe Biden about his son's laptop. It was Donald Trump because he didn't like what Chrissy Teigen had to say about him. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
My. You ever think it's appropriate for the President of the United States to direct or otherwise influence a social media company to take down its content?
I think it's a very slippery slope.
Mr. Roth, Ms. Gaddy, Mr. Baker, any evidence that Joe Biden's ever done that?
Certainly none that I'm aware of, no.
I don't recall anything like that.
I'm sorry, that President Biden did what, sir?
Has Joe Biden ever called Twitter, to your knowledge, or his White House at his behest to take down content or urge you to take down content?
I don't know the answer to that question, sir.
Well, I'm going to have to conclude at least from 3 of the 4, you don't know. There's no evidence he's ever done that, but there's plenty of evidence Donald J. Trump tried to do that. And if we're going to have a hearing about the misuse of social media and the intrusion of government in the content on social media, we've got an environment-rich target, but it's not Joe Biden. It's Donald J. Trump, and of course, we don't want to talk about that. We don't want to talk about Russian bots and Russian fabrications using fake accounts on Twitter to a political purpose, and it's not to help elect Democrats. And we don't want to talk about 4 years of Donald Trump manipulating the truth and trying to manipulate social media and threaten it, or directly to try to shape it by taking down content because it was critical of him personally. And that's what we ought to be talking about as we move forward, not the subject of today's hearing. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Donalds for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Real quick, Mr. Roth, you've stated already that what happened with the New York Post story was similar to the hack and leak scenarios from 2016. You also said that you actually were opposed to deleting the New York Post story. Who advocated for the removal of the New York Post story?
The company's decision to treat it as a violation.
Mr. Roth, who at the company actually went over your recommendation? Because you're pretty high up. Who overrode you?
The decision was communicated to me by my direct supervisor.
Who is that person?
Her name was Del Harvey. She was
Okay.
the vice president of trust and safety at the time.
All right, thank you so much. Ms. Gaddy, real quick, you said to the chairman earlier, and I want to paraphrase what I heard earlier, is that Twitter had no contact with anybody from the Biden team. Is that correct to your knowledge?
Not to my knowledge.
Put that up for me. Okay, over my right shoulder, we have an email. Reference, this is Saturday, October 24th, 5:39 p.m., referencing 5 different tweets. This is with a Twitter email chain. Under the line, it's more to review from the Biden team. Does anybody have a comment on how much interaction was happening with the Biden team at Twitter with respect to tweets that they wanted Twitter to review? Ms. Gaddy, Mr. Roth?
I'm not familiar with this email.
So you're not familiar with this email, Mr. Roth? Are you familiar with this email?
Only from what's been reported in the Twitter files.
Did you ever have contact with anybody from the Biden team?
No, sir, I did not. We explicitly separated the teams that would interact with campaigns from teams like mine that were responsible for content
How
moderation.
big was the organization in Twitter that was actually working with campaigns?
I couldn't say for sure.
Did you ever have any contact with the DNC?
Directly? No, I did not.
Did anybody at Twitter have any contact with anybody at the DNC?
I think it's likely that somebody at Twitter did, yes.
In these emails, it's listed that these are tweets that had to be flagged from the Biden team. That's what's in the files. You have no idea how many people actually engage with the Twitter team or how frequently that engagement happened.
No, and again, that was by design. We kept those functions separate from content moderation so that we could impartially assess reports like this.
Do you know how many tweets were actually flagged and taken down at the behest of the Biden team?
I wouldn't agree with the characterization of it as being at the behest of them. These tweets were reported, and Twitter independently evaluated them under its rules.
But the email is very clear. More to review from Biden team. The response 3 hours later at the bottom, hold this up real quick so we can see. The request at the bottom, it says, handled these. What does handled these mean?
My understanding is that these tweets contained non-consensual nude photos of Hunter Biden, and they were removed by the company under.
Hold on, real quick, Mr. Roth. How could you know so much about the content of these tweets? I mean, as far as I'm concerned, these are just web addresses. I don't know what's in these tweets. You have these things committed to memory that you know the content, but you don't know who you talk to at the Biden team?
Sir, I didn't meet with the Biden team, but there was extensive public reporting about these tweets specifically that uncovered what they were.
You know the contents of the tweets. It was obviously at Twitter, but you have no idea how often people who worked in your organization had with the Biden team during the end of the 2020 presidential elections.
I would emphasize that the people who interfaced with the campaigns were not part of my team or organization. I would know what the interactions were if they were on my team. It was a different part of the organization, not mine.
Let me ask you a separate question, and I'll ask it of you too, Mr. Baker. Have you guys been able to quantify the amount of in-kind contributions associated with taking down the New York Post story? Because the New York Post story was down for 2 weeks, give or take. Do you have any understanding of how much that story was limited by Twitter and also by other social media companies? What the impact of an in-kind contribution that would be to the Joe Biden presidential election in 2020?
I don't know the answer to that question, sir.
Do you think it's big?
I don't know the answer.
Do you think it's more than a maximum contribution to a campaign?
I wouldn't want to speculate.
Would you call it 25,000?
I don't know the answer to that question.
100,000?
Sir, I don't know the answer to the
A
question.
million?
I don't know the answer to the question.
Do you think Twitter will be in violation of federal election laws with the size of an in-kind contribution to take down a story, which is true, by the way, because you guys thought you knew something with limited information?
I'm not going to speculate on that sitting here today, sir. Try to propound a legal analysis of election laws.
I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, if she's here. It's your turn. You want to go? Okay. We won't start the clock till you get there.
Appreciate also your generosity. I just want to start off right here at the top here. This isn't even my line of questioning, but I'd like to submit to the record a Washington Post article now warning about Hunter Biden laptop disinformation, the guy who leaked it. Here's the deal. Before I even get into my questions, I think that the story here with the Washington Post reporting is that what they're saying right here, when the New York Post first reported in October 2020 that it had obtained contents of a laptop computer allegedly owned by Joe Biden's son Hunter, there was an immediate roadblock faced by other news outlets that hoped to corroborate reporting, as many did. The newspaper wasn't sharing what it obtained. New York Post had this alleged information and was trying to publish it without any corroboration, without any backup information. They were trying to publish it to Twitter. Twitter did not let them, and now they were upset. I believe that political operatives who sought to inject explosive disinformation with the Washington Post couldn't get away with it. And now they're livid, and they want the ability to do it again. They want the ability to inject this again. So they've dragged a social media platform here in Congress. They're weaponizing the use of this committee so that they can do it again. A whole hearing about a 24-hour hiccup in a right-wing political operation. That is why we are here right now. And it's just an abuse of public resources, an abuse of public time. We could be talking about health care. We could be talking about bringing down the cost of prescription drugs. We could be talking about abortion rights, civil rights, voting rights. But instead, we're talking about Hunter Biden's half-fake laptop story. I mean, this is an embarrassment. But I'll go into it. Ms. Navaroli, let's talk about something real. I'd like to show you a tweet posted by former President Trump about my colleagues and I on July 14, 2019. It says in part, quote, "Why don't they go back and help fix the totally broken and crime-infested places from which they came? Then come back and show us how it's done. These places need your help badly. You can't leave fast enough. I'm sure that Nancy Pelosi would be very happy as quickly to work out free travel arrangements." A day or two after that, Donald Trump publicly incited, violence at a rally, targeting 4 congresswomen, including myself, saying, "Go back to where you came from." Ms. Navaroli, as I understand it, you were the most senior member of Twitter's content moderation team, or a senior member of Twitter's content moderation team when this was posted. As part of your responsibilities, did you review this tweet?
Yes, it was my team's responsibility to review these tweets.
And what did you conclude?
My team, Ray, made the recommendation that for the first time, we find Donald Trump in violation of Twitter's policies and use the public interest interstitial.
For the first time.
Yes.
And at the time, Twitter's policy included a specific example when it came to banned abuse against immigrants, as they specifically included the phrase, "go back to your country," or go back to where you came from, correct?
Yes, that was specifically included in the content moderation guidance as an example.
You brought this up to the Vice President of Trust and Safety, Del Harvey, correct?
I did, yes.
And she overrode your assessment, didn't she?
Yes, she did.
And something interesting happened after she overrode your assessment. A day or two later, Twitter seemed to have changed their policies, didn't they?
Yes, that trope, "go back to where you came from," was removed from the content moderation guidance as an example.
So Twitter changed their own policy after the president violated it in order to potentially accommodate his tweet?
Yes.
Thank you. So much for bias against right wing on Twitter. Additionally, Ms. Navaroli, are you familiar with the account Libs of TikTok?
I have heard of it from the news, yes.
Mr. Roth, are you familiar with this account?
Yes, ma'am, I am.
Are you aware that from August 11th to August 16th, that account posted false information about Boston Children's Hospital, claiming that they were providing hysterectomies to children?
Yes, I am aware of that and other claims from the account.
And are you aware that this lie was then circulated by other prominent far-right influencers?
Yes.
And are you aware that all these claims, which I have reiterated were false, culminated in a real-life harassment and ultimately a bomb threat to the Boston Children's Hospital?
Yes, I am aware.
And this account is still on that platform today, isn't it?
Regrettably, yes, it is.
Despite inspiring a bomb threat due to the right-wing incitement of violence against trans Americans in this country, because they cannot let go of this obsession with fixating violence and inciting violence against trans and LGBT people, in addition to immigrants, in addition to women of color. This is a party that cannot pick on anyone their own size. And they are trying to co-opt an entire social media platform and use the power of this committee and of Congress in order to pursue a political agenda. I yield back.
Lady yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Fry for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This hearing shows who really has been in control of what is said to be one of the world's most widely used websites, Twitter. The American people probably didn't know who these witnesses were today, but these witnesses were powerful enough to silence an American president with just a few clicks from their California office. We're also learning that some of those in Washington, D.C. have forgotten their role and exercised their power to achieve ends antithetical to American principles of free speech and expression. The FBI is the lead federal agency responsible for investigating foreign influence operations. However, in recent years, the FBI has devoted countless amounts of time, taxpayer money, and manpower to combating Russian foreign influence on social media. The FBI, as one reporter noted, acted as a, quote, doorman to the vast program of social media surveillance and censorship encompassing agencies across the federal government, from the State Department to the Pentagon to the CIA. End quote. Reports suggest that thousands of reports from the FBI and the Foreign Influence Task Force were sent to Twitter. This isn't what the American people are paying for. This isn't what we trust the FBI to do. FBI agents shouldn't be sitting at a desk in Washington, D.C., scrolling through Twitter and emailing with social media companies. An email from one Twitter employee to another reads, quote, the FBI San Francisco Emergency Operations Center sent us the attached report of 207 tweets they believed may be in violation of our policies, end quote. Another email revealed that there are, quote, some folks in the Baltimore field office and at headquarters that are just doing keyboard searches for violations. Mr. Roth, Twitter usually found little evidence that the accounts the FBI flagged had ties to foreign influence. Is that correct?
In part. But we received many reports from the FBI, particularly related to malign foreign interference, that were highly credible and were constructive. So I would say it was a bit of a mixed bag.
And you pushed back to the FBI when they would send you a list of American-based accounts. Is that correct?
Politely, but yes.
Mr. Roth, it appears that Twitter employees were under pressure by the FBI and other government agencies to validate these theories of foreign influence. Would you agree with that?
No, I wouldn't agree with the word pressure. The FBI was quite careful and quite consistent to request review of the accounts, but not to cross the line into advocating for Twitter to take any particular action.
So flagging American accounts, in your view, is not foreign or theories of foreign influence. There's not pressure there just by flagging it to you.
Again,
domestic accounts.
I don't think it's a great use of the Bureau's time, but I wouldn't characterize how they communicated with us as pressure.
Mr. Roth, you enjoyed these meetings with the FBI, it seems, based on the tweets behind me or the communications behind me. In internal communications at Twitter, you said, definitely not meeting with the FBI, I swear. Is that correct?
I believe I was joking with a colleague at the time, but yes.
But I can assume that you were meeting with the FBI when you were communicating with your colleague. Is that correct?
Yes, one of my job responsibilities was meeting with law enforcement about election security.
And just so I'm clear, the person you're communicating with here says, very boring business meeting that is definitely not about Trump. I assume that's also sarcasm.
Yes, that's my assumption.
And we can assume that Twitter was having these meetings with the FBI about President Trump, correct?
No, sir. The meetings that I was a part of with the FBI were almost entirely and exclusively focused on malign foreign interference, so accounts being operated outside of the United States by other governments, not on the accounts of Americans.
So what is the basis of this communication then where you talk about not meeting with Trump or not meeting about Trump?
Again, I think those comments are sarcasm, but the context for this interaction was the need to mark my calendar private after another Twitter employee joined one of those meetings with the FBI unexpectedly. And so I had to implement additional security measures around my calendar. This was a fairly banal interaction with a colleague.
Mr. Chairman, I yield the rest of my time to Mr. Jordan.
Can I ask Mr. Jordan?
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Roth, was there ever any visibility filtering that was hard-coded by Twitter employees into accounts of specific users?
Twitter employees were responsible for building the systems that performed visibility filtering, and then that filtering would have been applied either automatically.
I'm asking a very specific question. I'm asking, was the code written in a way that for certain accounts, those accounts, unique in and of themselves, would be visibility filtering, to use your term, so that they wouldn't have as much reach or as much influence?
The term hard coding suggests that it was permanent and immutable, and I wouldn't agree with that, no.
But it did happen, is what you're saying. There was hard-coded into some of these accounts of specific users by Twitter employees this ability to filter and limit the reach of that particular post, or that particular tweet, I should say.
Again, I wouldn't say that they were hard coded.
Thank you.
Chair recognizes Ms. Brown for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Comer and Ranking Member Raskin, for holding this hearing today. Social media has been a revolutionary gift of the 21st century. From helping people across the world build meaningful connections to learning a new skill set, these platforms have played a significant role in creating an interconnected global world. When handled responsibly, social media serves as a useful resource with many positive outcomes. However, social media is not without its flaws, and the challenges are much larger than any specific incident or decision by one private company. Recently, social media has contributed to the rise and amplification of domestic extremist content and organizing. This is extremely concerning and, unfortunately, is contributing to the division of our society. According to an Anti-Defamation League survey, 66% of the LGBTQ+ respondents, that's a full 2/3, experienced harassment online. 37% of Jewish respondents and 34% of African Americans respondents said the same. This is truly disturbing. The power that social media has to inspire real-world action, both good and bad, is well known to all of us. And sadly, the hate online does not stay online. Social media has the power to influence not just here at home, but those who are watching us abroad. For example, an online disinformation campaign by a hostile foreign power can have the power to sway a close election. So, Mr. Roth, in a recent interview, you stated, and I quote, "Beginning in 2017, every platform, Twitter included, started to invest really heavily in building out an election integrity function." So I ask, were those investments driven in part by bipartisan concerns raised by Congress and the U.S. government after the Russian influence operation in the 2016 presidential election?
Thank you for the question. Yes, those concerns were fundamentally bipartisan. The Senate's investigation of Russian active measures was a bipartisan effort. The report was bipartisan. And I think we all share concerns with what Russia is doing to meddle in our elections.
Thank you so much. Did those investments include better information sharing mechanisms with the federal government?
Yes. I think one of the key failures that we identified after 2016 was that there was very little information coming from the government and from intelligence services to the private sector. The private sector had the power to remove bots and to take down foreign disinformation campaigns, but we didn't always know where to look without leads supplied by the intelligence community. That was one of the failures highlighted in the Senate Intelligence Committee's report and in the Mueller investigation, and that was one of the things we set out to fix in 2017.
Thank you for that. And Mr. Roth, were those communication channels useful to Twitter as it worked to combat foreign influence operations?
Absolutely. I would say they were one of the most essential pieces of how Twitter prepared for future elections.
Thank you so much. So clearly, we must come together as a committee to stand up and protect our country from foreign election interference and disinformation. I sincerely look forward to spending more time with this committee, working to understand how to fight back against our adversaries and strengthen our democracy. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Chair recognizes Ms. Green for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Baker, Ms. Gaddy, Mr. Roth, and Ms. Navaroli. you can consider your speech canceled during my time because you canceled mine. You see, you permanently banned my personal Twitter account, and it was my campaign account also. So let's talk about election interference, shall we? January 2nd, 2002, you permanently banned my Twitter account. This was the account that I would put my campaign ads on, raise money on, fight back when attacked with lies, and be able to talk to my voters in my district. But you banned it. And then let me explain. My account was not reinstated until November 21st, 2022. That was after my election on November 8th. You know, at your company, or your former company where you worked, Twitter employees, over 98% of them donate to Democrats. So while you coordinated with DHS, the FBI, the CIA, our government, and outside groups to permanently ban, shadow ban conservative Americans and candidates like me and the former president of the United States, President Donald J. Trump, you were censoring and wrongfully violating our First Amendment free speech rights. Guess what? None of you hold security clearances. None of you are elected, and none of you represent 750,000 people like I do. Let's explain. 52 United States Law 10101. No person shall intimidate, threaten, coerce, or attempt to stop any other person for the purpose of interfering with their rights to vote, or to vote as he may choose. You didn't shadow ban or permanently ban my Democrat opponent. No, you did that to me. And that was wrong, and it was against the law. You see, not only that, was it me that you violated my First Amendment rights? You violated countless conservative Americans. These were doctors that were trying to tell the truth about COVID, doctors that were having success treating people with ivermectin that you all would not allow to be talked about on your platform. These were parents complaining about their school boards, teaching gender lies in their schools, biological males entering their daughters' bathrooms and sports. These were also people questioning the 2020 election, and guess what? That's Americans' First Amendment right. These were people talking about voting machines. You know what? Democrats did that in 2019, before the 2020 election. On Twitter, people could question elections such as 2016, saying Hillary won, but in 2020, no one could question elections saying Trump won. You abused the power of a large corporation, big tech, to censor Americans. And you want to know something? Guess what? I'm so glad that you're censored down. I'm so glad you've lost your jobs. Thank God Elon Musk bought Twitter. And you know what? Let's talk about something a little bit further. It's amazing to me, Mr. Roth, as the head and trust of safety at Twitter, your ability, or should I say inability, to remove child porn. Now, here's something that disgusts me about you. In your doctoral dissertation entitled Gay Data, you argued that minors should have access to Grindr, an adult male gay hookup app. Minors? Really? You know, Elon Musk took over Twitter and he banned 44,000 accounts that were promoting child porn. You permanently banned my Twitter account, but you allowed child porn all over Twitter. Twitter had become a platform, you said, connecting queer young adults. You also wrote on Twitter in 2010, can high school students ever meaningfully consent to sex with their teachers? In 2021, while you were the director of trust and safety on Twitter, an underage boy and his mother announced a lawsuit against Twitter because Twitter was benefiting from and refused to remove a lewd video featuring this boy and another minor. That is repulsive. But you violated me. What were my tweets? Okay, let's talk about them. I was talking about the deaths being reported on VAERS. By the way, that's on the CDC website. I was also saying that I didn't think any entity should enforce a non-FDA approved vaccine or mask. Guess what? A lot of people agreed with me, but you called that COVID misinformation. By the way, I'm a member of Congress and you're not. I also said the controversial COVID-19 vaccines should not be forced on our military. You want to know something? Republicans stopped that in the NDAA.
Ladies, time has expired.
And your time has expired. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes Mr. Gomez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Roth, please explain to us why Ms. Marjorie Taylor Greene, or the representative from Georgia, was removed from Twitter.
Thank you for the question, Congressman. My recollection is that her personal account was banned from Twitter after repeated written notices due to repeated violations of the Twitter rules.
Can you add a little specificity to the violation of the Twitter rules?
Yes. Again, I didn't have access to my Twitter email, documents, anything that would have let me prepare to answer that in more detail, but my recollection is that the Congresswoman repeatedly violated Twitter's policies about sharing misinformation about COVID-19. She received multiple written warnings about that conduct. She received multiple timeouts related to that conduct. And then ultimately, consistent with the written and published policy, those repeated violations resulted in her account being permanently suspended.
Mr. Chairman,
so in essence,
I'd like to take a point of personal privilege.
It's still my time.
We'll stop.
Still my
clock.
It's still my time.
Mr. Chairman.
Point of order by Mr. Raskins.
Yeah, I don't believe that members of this committee have the right to interrupt someone's testimony because their
Point
name
of
was
personal
mentioned.
privilege.
And-
You were mentioning my name, Mr. Raskin.
Yeah, no, I understand, but that's not the rule, Ms. Green. I don't think a member.
That is the rule in Congress.
Well, then I'd like
we can take a point
I'd like
of
the
personal
parliamentarian
privilege.
to rule on whether any member of this committee has the right to interrupt a witness's testimony because they mentioned the name of a member of Congress.
You mentioned my name, Mr. Raskin.
Yeah, I'm not testifying.
Chair recognizes Ms. Green.
Thank you, Mr.
For your
Chairman.
point of privilege, very briefly.
Thank you. For Mr. Roth, who made you in charge of what is true and what's not true?
We'll,
Does she get to reopen her question?
No,
Okay.
we'll go back to Mr. Gomez, and Mr. Gomez, please remember the decorum of the committee. The clock, we'll restart the clock now. You didn't lose any time. Chair recognizes Mr. Gomez.
Thank you so much. The gentle lady from Georgia was suspended from Twitter for knowingly and consistently spreading conspiracy theories about COVID-19 vaccine, right? Which is shameful, especially in a pandemic where a million people have lost their lives. With that, I yield my rest of my time to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Goldman.
Thank you, Mr. Gomez. Let's talk about the so-called Twitter files, which my Republican colleagues seem to think are God's gift to journalism. In one about the Hunter Biden laptop, the author says that every single fact in the New York Post story was accurate. And Chairman Comer, I notice you blew up the cover of that New York Post story, which I appreciate you doing that because I'd like to dig into this article. The very first paragraph says Hunter Biden introduced his father to a top executive at a Ukrainian energy firm less than a year before the elder Biden pressured government officials in Ukraine into firing a prosecutor who was investigating the company. That is false. 100% false.
Is the gentleman sure about that?
Yes, in fact, I am sure about that. And as the lead counsel in the first impeachment investigation, we proved that he was actually fired because he was not prosecuting corruption, not that he was fired because he was prosecuting corruption.
Corruption of the president's son's company. I'm sorry, would the gentleman yield corruption of the president's son's company?
I'd like to reclaim my time.
Gentleman's recognized.
The fact that Joe Biden fired, consistent with U.S. policy in every single European country, the prosecutor general in Ukraine because he did not prosecute corruption, including at companies like Burisma, has been proven over and over and over. And if you want to know who actually prosecuted Burisma, Chairman Comer, you should talk to the British authorities, because they were the ones who were prosecuting Burisma, and they couldn't get any cooperation from the Ukrainian prosecutor general. so that's why he was fired. So right off the top, the very first paragraph of this so-called bombshell story is completely false. Now, what is the allegation that we are hearing from our Republican colleagues about the connection to Joe Biden and Burisma? It is an email from a Burisma employee thanking Hunter Biden for organizing a meeting with the Vice President Biden. We know nothing about the substance of that meeting. We know nothing about how long they met. It was not on Vice President Biden's schedule. And in fact, I would ask my Republican colleagues, do you meet with foreign businessmen? Do you meet with foreign diplomats? If we were to say to you every single time you met with somebody that you discussed something that you're voting on, how would you react? It's preposterous. And Chairman Comer, you have said in your opening statement that Joe Biden lied to the American people. That is a bold, bold accusation. And so far, we've seen no actual evidence of any lies or any support for Joe Biden being involved in anything having to do with Ukraine other than promoting U.S. foreign policy. And I hope that you are not abusing the power as chairman of this committee, and that you are not wasting taxpayer dollars on a fishing expedition into a civilian child of a president for political purposes. I yield back.
The gentleman yield to a quick question. You don't have to. It's your choice. You yield.
Yeah, please.
So
I would love to discuss this.
are you admitting that Joe Biden did get the prosecutor in Ukraine fired?
I think it's very clear that Vice President Biden, along with all of our allies in Europe, pressured Ukraine to fire a corrupt prosecutor general who was not charging corruption cases that would have included potentially Burisma.
Corruption with his son's company?
Yes. In fact, if what he wanted was the prosecutor general to prosecute corruption, and the allegations that you are making and that the Russians are making, because this is all part of Russian propaganda, is that Burisma was corrupt and Joe Biden was trying to stop an investigation into Burisma. That is categorically false, and there is no evidence of it.
Mr. Chairman, we're going to recognize one more speaker. We've been requested by the presenters for a brief bathroom break. If you'll allow us, we have one more questioner, and then we'll take that break. Chair recognizes Mr. Timmons for 5 minutes, and then we'll have a 5 to 10 minute break. Mr. Timmons.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have a big picture problem right now, and we're talking about Twitter specifically and Hunter Biden's laptop, but it's not just that. It's the general trend of the media, social media, the FBI, DOJ, doing one side's bidding. That's the issue. There's mistakes that have been made, and we keep looking back at these mistakes and say, oh, that shouldn't have happened that way. We are going to have a new policy to avoid that from happening again. But every mistake benefits one side. Every mistake benefits one side. Let's go back to 2016. The Democrat National Committee and the Clinton campaign paid Fusion GPS to fabricate the Steele dossier, which was the basis of this entire Russia collusion investigation. Special counsel, we spent $40 million pursuing it. There was no evidence of the Trump campaign colluding with Russia. There was none. It was actually fabricated by the Democrats and the Clinton campaign to create a narrative to damage President Trump. So that was a mistake. We all know that now. That was the conclusion of that investigation. And as a side note, that's why Adam Schiff is no longer on Intel, because he lied about that investigation. He said, as the chair of Intel, I have all this information. He abused his position, and that's why he was removed from Intel. So next, we go to 2020. Another mistake. We have something that is real labeled as something that is fake. We tell the American people that we're going to have an honest, open conversation about issues, about challenges that our country faces, and everybody has their own facts. Congressman from New York is mentioning his facts. It's just very bizarre that Hunter Biden making tens of thousands of dollars a month with no credentials from a business in Ukraine. Whether they're being investigated, who knows? I mean, these are all speculation, and it's something the American people can't really digest because we don't know the answers to it. And when we're told the answers by our government, by big corporations, by big tech, and they're repeatedly wrong, it creates a trust issue. It creates a trust issue. So the American people do not trust what they're being told. They do not trust what they're being told. We're going to dig into the Hunter Biden laptop briefly. Jack Dorsey has said that he did not make that decision. Ms. Gaddy, did you make the decision to censor the Hunter Biden laptop story?
Yes, I was involved in that decision.
Who was the final arbiter? Because Mr. Roth has said he disagreed with that decision. Who was the final person that said, we're going to do this?
I ultimately approved that decision.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Roth, you have said previously that you did not believe that the New York Post story violated any policy. You've said that multiple times today. How many times, other than this one, did something get banned or flagged that you disagreed with? Is this the only one?
No, sir, not at all.
Okay, so
these are
Twitter
challenging.
Twitter repeatedly banned and censored material that you thought shouldn't be censored. Is that fair?
These are challenging judgment calls, and I think reasonable minds can differ about whether a given piece of
Okay,
content.
but on this one you did disagree. I just want to say, the American people need to have valid information to process decisions. I would argue that denying the American people the substance of Hunter Biden's laptop story was Hunter Biden's laptop was wrong. You got photos and text messages of Hunter Biden committing multiple felonies, which was never actually criminal. There were no criminal charges. Must be nice. Hunter Biden and James Biden were negotiating deals with Chinese Communist Party agents, one of whom Hunter Biden classified as the spy chief of China. We have evidence at least one of Hunter's deals with Chinese Communist Party-linked entities. Joe Biden was given a 10% equity stake in the joint venture. You have evidence that the Bidens were trying to sell America's natural resources to the Chinese, and this is my personal favorite. Evidence that the Bidens and a Chinese energy company owned by the Chinese Communist Party had leased office space no further than 3 miles from where we're sitting right now. And the man running for president had his own office in that office space, his own personal office. You think the American people deserve to know that? I do. I think that there's a lot of smoke surrounding the Biden's relationship with the Chinese Communist Party. There's a lot of smoke surrounding the Biden's relationship with Ukraine. And they deserve to have the facts to make a decision for themselves. Y'all got it wrong in 2016 with Russian collusion. You got it wrong with Hunter Biden's laptop in 2020. You got it wrong regarding COVID at every turn. The American people deserve better.
Will the gentleman yield for a question?
Gentleman yield.
Will the gentleman yield for a question?
Gentleman yield.
Yes.
Then Mr. Raskins.
Mr. Baker, did you talk to any of the 51 former Intel officials who sent the now famous letter on October 19th, 2020, saying that the story in the New York Post had all the classic earmarks of a Russian information operation? Have you talked to any of those 51 prior to that letter being sent on the 19th or after?
Sir, I can't remember who's on that group, but
Clapper, Brennan, Morrill.
I've talked to those people during the course of my career, yes.
Have you talked to them in your time at Twitter?
I can't remember who's on that list, so I'm afraid.
No, how about the 3 I just mentioned, Clapper and Brennan?
Okay. All right.
Mr.
Chairman, regular order.
Last question. Feel free to answer. Then we'll recognize Mr. Raskins.
Well, I was going to ask the gentleman before he left whether he's denying the Russian disinformation propaganda campaign that we've heard about from witnesses, or he's just denying Russian collusion, which was something that Mr. Mueller specifically did not address in his final report. He said collusion is not a legal concept. He was looking just at conspiracy, and he said there wasn't substantial enough evidence to charge conspiracy, but there were dozens of contacts between Donald Trump and the Russians that were documented in that report. That's all I wanted to say.
Chairman, Chair recognizes Mr. Jordan, then we'll recess for...
Just to restate the question that's on the table to Mr. Baker. Did he talk with Mr. Clapper, Mr. Brennan, or anyone else that he knows of on that who signed that?
Point of order,
letter?
Mr. Chairman. Whose time is this? Now?
This was the remaining 3 seconds of...
He doesn't have remaining time.
Okay.
He's gone over by a minute.
We're over.
Mr. Baker, feel free to answer the question if you want, and then we'll take a recess.
Mr. Jordan, I don't recall discussing that publication that they did about the Hunter Biden laptop with any of those people.
We'll stand in recess for 5 minutes. When we return, Mr. Garcia will begin our questioning. We're in recess for 5 to 10 minutes. Again, I want to thank the witnesses for your indulgence, and I know it's a long day. You're doing great. We really appreciate it. Now we'll resume questioning, and Chair recognizes Mr. Garcia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses, and I just want to start off also by just apologizing to our witnesses, particularly Mr. Roth, for just the homophobic rant and comments that were recently just made from the gentle lady from Georgia. That was really shameful. And I know that we're here to talk about serious issues, and we're having conversations about Grindr and other issues, which is not really what this hearing is about. So, apologize to all of our witnesses. Want to note that I am someone that you would probably call a Twitter super user. I use the social platform constantly. I communicate regularly. It's how I get my news. It's how I find out what's happening in popular culture. And I admire what Jack Dorsey, Evan Williams, and Christopher Stone actually tried to build as a company. I wish I could say the same for what the platform is today. I think to me and to many other users, we've seen the site currently degraded. We've seen Mr. Musk more interested in attacking journalists and uplifting conspiracy theories and actually running a company. And I think we can all agree that just overall the service has substantially degraded. I think just an example is the forced For You page mess that I personally don't like, and I think most folks don't as well. But I want to know more seriously that Mr. Musk and the current team has also done damage as far as trust and safety on the platform. He's gutted the trust and safety teams that have been described. He's eliminated content management systems, and the human rights team, which, as we know, has ceased to operate. I do want to just take a minute to thank Mr. Roth and particularly Ms. Navaroli and your teams. I know that you were trying your best. I want to thank all of the folks that worked at Twitter because they believed in its mission. A mission I'm not sure holds true today completely, but it's one that I know a lot of folks worked on. And so just thank you for that work. And mistakes were made, and clearly you have actually lived up to those mistakes and the issues that have existed. But I especially want to thank you for your work around the pandemic. The pandemic took over 1 million American lives, 1,300 in my own city back home. And your decisions in content moderation actually saved countless lives in this country, including the work you did by moderating or banning members even of this committee who peddled in lies and were actively causing death and harm to others. And so for that work on content moderation, I want to thank you. And I want to go back to something that Mr. Roth said briefly. You had mentioned earlier in this hearing that you thought that currently there's still systemic election interference and interference happening. How serious do you think the current threat from Russia and other countries is to current election interference?
I think we can look to the evidence from the midterms to know that these campaigns are ongoing and they are serious. And it's not just Russia, Iran, and China, though they are the big players. There's now a playbook for how election interference works. And it's unfortunately all too cheap and all too easy for countries to try to carry this out.
Thank you. And I think it's pretty clear what we've learned today. One thing we've learned, which hasn't been much, by the way, is that there's current election interference happening today by Russia and other actors. And so that is something that's serious. That's which the focus of this hearing should actually be about, versus all of this kind of nonsense and lies and conspiracy theories that this committee is actually focused on today. I want to take the remaining balance of my time and yield to Ms. Ocasio-Cortez.
I thank the gentleman from California. I'd like to raise and follow up on a point that the opposition and the other side of the aisle is making, which is trying to insinuate that there is something scandalous or unusual about federal agency outreach to social media platforms and other organizations such as Twitter. The insinuation here is that in the FBI and other agencies reaching out to Twitter, that there's something nefarious about this, that this was some sort of partisan weaponization or attempt to intimidate. But we actually have quite a documented history of representatives from the Trump administration hailing the progress that the government had made in working with companies like Twitter to counter foreign influence operations and other areas of concern. In early March 2020, right before the Super Tuesday primary election, several Trump administration officials, including Mike Pompeo, Bill Barr, Chad Wolf, and acting director of national intelligence, Richard Grenell, issued a statement praising the government's cooperation with the private sector to fend off foreign interference and said that the relationship was, quote, stronger than it's ever been. This was around this whole time where there's this grievance around this. And listen to what DHS Secretary Chad Wolf had to say just weeks before the 2020 presidential election. We now have direct lines of communication with tech and social media companies and election officials so that both parties can seamlessly take action against false information spreading online. I would argue that this information from the Trump administration would say that they would support your decision in temporarily suspending this disinformation that seemed to be coming out from the New York Post. So with that, I yield back to the chair.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes Mr. Burchett for 5 minutes.
Thank you, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Gaddy, Charlie Kirk and Dan Bongino are conservative commentators. Is that a fair characteristic? Just yes or no would be fine.
I believe so, but I'm not familiar with them.
Okay. The posters behind me show the side of Twitter that is not available to users. Is that correct?
This appears to be a view of some of our agent tooling, but I did not have access to that, so I'm not very familiar with that.
Okay. Well, Ms. Gaddy, the labels identify status that have been assigned to these accounts. Is that correct?
I don't know.
Ma'am, these are your internal things. You're telling me you don't receive these, you don't know what they mean?
Representative, I did not have access to these tools, and so I don't know. They look familiar to me.
As an executive, you did not have access to inside information at Twitter. Okay. Ms. Gaddy, Mr. Bongino's account, there's a few words under the verified and active. Can you read the first two labels under verified and active? They're the yellow ones.
Notification spikes, search blacklist.
All right, thank you. Ms. Bongino, ma'am, Mr. Bongino has more than 3.5 million Twitter followers. Is that correct, would you say?
I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay, well, that is correct. Let's look at Mr. Kirk's account. Ms. Gaddy, can I get you to read the yellow labels on Mr. Kirk's account? Can you see those?
I'm sorry, I can't see them from right here.
All right. Do you know that Mr. Kirk has almost 2 million followers?
I was not aware of that.
Okay. Let me ask you, what is a search blacklist?
I do not know specifically what that is, but I could make a guess if that would be helpful.
Why don't you make a guess for me, please?
We do, when I was at Twitter, there was an ability to prevent something from appearing in one of the tabs of search results.
Okay, thank you. What does do not amplify mean?
To the best of my recollection, when I was at Twitter, it would mean that we would not recommend or amplify that content in the parts of Twitter where Twitter was making recommendations.
Thank you, ma'am. In 2018, you said that Twitter does not shadow ban. Twitter did, however, engage in what is called visibility filtering. One Twitter employee described visibility filtering as a way for us to suppress what people see to different levels. Do you agree with that characterization?
I'm sorry, can you please repeat the question?
I said Twitter, okay, they engaged in what is called visibility filtering. One Twitter employee described visibility filtering as a way for us to suppress what people see to different levels. Do you agree with that characterization?
I agree that visibility filtering does give an ability to change.
Okay. Shadow banning, ma'am, is understood that the practice is limiting the visibility of a user's post without their knowledge. How is visibility filtering any different?
Representative, I believe there are different definitions of shadow banning.
Okay. But you said that Twitter in 2018 does not shadow ban. Was that a truthful statement, ma'am? Was that a lie?
At that time, I'd specifically defined shadow banning to mean something different than visibility filtering.
You also said that Twitter does not shadow ban based on political viewpoints or ideology. Do you stand by those comments?
While I was at Twitter, to the best of my knowledge, we did not do that.
Okay. Mr. Roth, on January 22nd, 2017, you tweeted that there were actual Nazis living in the White House. Do you still stand by that comment? Yes or no?
Sir, I regret the language I used. No, I do not.
Okay, Mr. Roth, earlier in your testimony, you said you regretted tweeting that, quote, actual Nazis are living in the White House. However, Iran's Ayatollah sent anti-Semitic tweets, one stating, quote, Israel is a malignant, cancerous tumor that has to be removed and eradicated. Yes or no, did Twitter ever ban the Ayatollah or remove this hateful anti-Semitic tweet? Yes or no?
To the best of my knowledge, Twitter did not remove that tweet.
The answer is no. Mr. Chairman, it's clear that conservative voices are being silenced on social media and in the mainstream. I appreciate this hearing. I might also suggest we look into holding one on DirecTV, Newsmax, and OAN. I give the rest of my time to Mr. Jordan.
I thank the gentleman for yielding and for his good questions. So the user knows when their account's been suspended or blocked, but they don't know when they have some of these gold terms that were under Mr. Bongino and Mr. Kirk. Is that right, Mr. Roth?
As of the time that I worked at Twitter, yes, that's correct.
So they don't know if they're on the search blacklist. They don't know if they're on the do not amplify. They don't know that.
That's correct. Twitter did not disclose that.
So you did that to these two accounts. What I want to know did you know, Mr. Roth, if that was at the prompting of anyone from the government?
Gentleman's time's expired, but please answer the question.
No, sir, I'm not aware of any requests or orders or demands or anything from the government requesting that visibility filtering be applied to those accounts or any others.
Chair recognizes Mr. Frost for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Look, I mean, I've been sitting here for over 2 hours, and I'm still not really seeing the point of this hearing. Is it to solve the problems of the American people, what people are struggling with? No. We get it. My Republican colleagues wish that the Hunter Biden story would have helped them win the 2020 election, and that didn't happen. And so they're angry about it, and that's the point of this hearing. You know, it was actually the foundation of the chairman's opening statement. It's why he brought up that poll on the 2020 election. That's what this is all about. And so I want to say to my colleagues, don't worry. There's still many platforms you can spread disinformation on, Parler, Truth Social, that have questionable editorial policies but aren't here today. There was no collusion, as the witnesses have said, under oath. There was no pressuring from the United States government, as we heard under oath. We're wasting our time here bullying former Twitter employees, so that way, it's calling the ref, so that way in the future, when they want disinformation to be put on the internet, social platforms will be scared to call them out down the road. It's called calling the ref. But let's talk about the root of this hearing. My Republican colleagues would have folks believe that Democrats are preparing for some sort of major culture war. And there's a difference between a culture war and how culture naturally changes, culture change. Some on this committee are very resistant to culture change. I mean, just yesterday we heard a member equate immigration negatively to changing our culture, black and brown folks coming to our country. The reality is that culture changes, it adopts, it welcomes more people, it becomes more understanding, and it also decides to reassess what's acceptable behavior and rhetoric. It could be different now than it was in, say, the 1950s. In this supposed culture war, they often conflate the right to free speech with the non-existent right to not be criticized or held accountable for what you say on the internet or even in real life. And just because it's legal to say something and the government won't throw you in jail for it, doesn't mean the rest of the world, and sometimes even your own family, have to associate themselves with you or your comments. Mr. Roth, you helped set up content moderation policy at Twitter. What type of user tweets were more likely to get limited? Did it have to do with racism, sexism, homophobia, violence, or were y'all looking for people who were supporting Donald Trump, President Trump, and limiting those?
Our policies were built fundamentally to be viewpoint neutral. They were focused on harm reduction, looking to things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights with a focus on protecting people's safety, people's right to free and fair elections, people's rights to free speech. And we built concern with those rights into our policies.
So being a decent human being.
That's certainly what we tried to do,
gotcha.
yes.
Ms. Naravoli, earlier you testified about a 2019 tweet that was about President Trump, and I think it was from Ms. Teagan. What was the tweet about?
Would you like me to give the direct quote?
Yeah.
Please excuse my language, this is a direct quote, but Chrissy Teigen referred to Donald Trump as a pussy-ass bitch.
Okay. Free speech. And what happened after Ms. Teigen posted her tweet? What did the White House do? What did the Trump White House do?
From my understanding, the White House reached out to ask that this tweet be removed. It was my team's job. This fell underneath the policy for abusive behaviors, and we evaluated underneath our insults policy. At that time, up to 3 insults were allowed, and so it was our job to determine how many insults were included within that phrase.
So the Trump White House reached out, not an agency, but the White House reached out and requested that you remove the tweet?
From my understanding, yes.
Okay. Mr. Roth, you mentioned a serious problem of foreign interference in our elections. Did you see that mass interference work more in support of right-wing candidates like President Trump in 2016 or President Biden in 2020?
Thank you for the question. It's an important one, and I don't think there's a clear or easy answer to this. We saw Russian operatives playing both sides and often playing them against each other. One of the most enraging interactions that my team saw were accounts operated out of the same Russian troll farm arguing with each other. And they were manufacturing drama both on Democratic sides and on the Republican.
So it's still a huge issue.
Absolutely.
100%. Well, there you have it. There's issues of big tech. There are serious issues we need to litigate. Hunter Biden's laptop is not one of them. And like many of my colleagues have said, we need to talk about these issues, how January 6th maybe could have been prevented if Twitter had taken action due to the hateful speech, and how we have foreign interference in our elections. Why are folks on this committee so obsessed with Twitter's editorial decision on Hunter Biden's laptop? Would they hold the same hearings of the editorial decisions of Fox News and Newsmax? Free speech is about the government limiting speech around about the public. My governor, Ron DeSantis, is doing that right now. I have a venue in my district that he's revoking the liquor license of, trying to close because they had a drag show. We have teachers who are not able to teach the curriculum that they want because they disagree with Ron DeSantis and his view of the world. That is limiting free speech, and I'd love to see this committee bring in some of these governors who are abusing their power, like Governor DeSantis in my state of Florida, to limit the free speech of people. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Gosar for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this important hearing, and thank you for our witnesses for appearing as well. I want to be clear. Despite claims in witness testimonies, government cannot deputize the private sector for actions that would be otherwise be restricted by the Constitution. In this case, the censorship of lawful speech. Now I want to direct you to a tweet over my shoulder sent by President Trump on October 5th, 2020, before Twitter banned him from the platform. This was after President Trump had become infected with COVID and received treatment at Walter Reed Medical Center. It says in part, "Don't be afraid of COVID. Don't let it dominate your life," end of quote. Do you see that, Mr. Roth?
Yes, sir, I do.
Less than an hour later, you received an email from James Baker at Twitter, reproduced behind me as well, saying, quote, "Why isn't this POTUS tweet a violation of our COVID-19 policy, especially the don't be afraid COVID statement," end of quote. Isn't that correct, Mr. Roth?
Yes, I believe that's the email displayed.
Now, Mr. Baker, was it your understanding that the Twitter COVID-19 policy was people should be afraid of COVID?
Sir, my recollection.
Yes or no?
Could you repeat the question, sir?
Was it your understanding that Twitter's COVID-19 policy was, quote, people should be afraid of COVID? Yeah.
At that point in time, I did not fully understand what Twitter's COVID misinformation policy was, and so I was trying to understand.
I'm recapturing my time. So maybe you thought that Twitter's policy was that it should dominate people's lives. Is that what you thought?
I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time hearing you, sir.
So is it the fact that Twitter, don't let it dominate people's lives? Is that the problem with the tweet?
At that point in time, I did not understand fully. I was relatively new at Twitter, and I was trying to understand what the policy was, and therefore I was.
I'm just going to ask you, the other two were asked, where did you go to medical school?
I beg your pardon?
Where did you go to medical school?
I did not go to medical school.
Good. Now, I'd like to have a yes or no from each of the witnesses on these following questions. Did you or others at Twitter communicate with government officials by means of disappearing messaging systems like Signal, Snapchat, or Wicker? Mr. Baker, yes or no?
Have I ever communicated with a government official using those?
Yes or no?
I don't recall.
Ms. Gaddy?
Not to the best of my recollection.
Yes.
Mr. Rowley?
Not to my recollection, no.
Once again, did you or others at Twitter receive requests from federal law enforcement to allow criminal activity or content whose distribution is criminal to proceed on Twitter? Mr. Baker?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question, sir.
Ms. Gaddy.
Can you please repeat the question, sir?
Mr. Roth.
If I understood the question correctly, it was whether we received requests to allow unlawful activity, and
Yes.
the answer is no.
Okay, Ms. Navaroli.
Not to my knowledge, no.
Now, I'd like to submit for the record an article by the New York Post titled, quote, Twitter refused to remove child porn because it didn't violate policies. Ms. Gaddy, who was involved in this determination?
I'm not familiar with this situation.
Mr. Roth, are you familiar with it?
No, sir, I'm not.
Once again, I'd like a yes or no from each of the witnesses. Did you apply labels to users with an administrative tool to downrank them? Mr. Baker.
I'm sorry, sir. I'm having a very hard time hearing your questions.
Ms. Gaddy.
I'm having the same problem, sir. Can you please repeat the question?
Mr. Roth.
I'm not sure I understood the question, sir.
Well, I'm asking you, did anybody use an administrative tool to downrank users?
Yes, sir. That's a part of Twitter's content moderation capabilities.
Mr. Baker?
Well, I'll rely on Mr. Roth.
Okay, Ms. Gaddy?
Yes, we're very public about our recommendation system and how they work.
Mr. Chairman, today's witnesses played a central, powerful, and disturbing role in limiting not only free speech, but even people's good faith inquiries and research regarding their own health. The internet is increasingly where my constituents go to engage in civic discourse. Our liberties as Americans will be diminished if we do not recognize our speech is increasingly virtual and right now subject to hostility and threatened through bans and deplatforming. The suggestions by witnesses that all of the removal of, quote, lawful but awful speech, quote, was done in favor of users is bunk. You could just as easily provide content filter options to allow lawful speech, letting users decide what lawful materials they do or don't want to engage with. But you didn't. You censored and manipulated millions of people. Do not allow people like this sitting in front of us today to be the arbiters of truth. I urge my colleagues to support my Section 230 reform, Stop the Censorship Act, which empowers users with the editorial contract. Our private businesses, you always have a contract with your customers. Allow them to pick. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes Ms. Bailett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to say, as a former history teacher, I care a lot about the facts and the details, so let's dive in. On December 4th, then-ranking member Comer appeared on Fox News and alleged that what Elon Musk's Twitter files showed was, quote, evidence that the Biden campaign colluded with big tech to suppress a story that we now know is 100% true, unquote. That is simply not true. It is not true based on what we knew then. It is not true based on what we know now. Mr. Roth, in a declaration to the FEC in December 2020, you stated, quote, I did not receive any communications from or have had any communications with representatives of Biden for President, the Democratic National Committee, or any of their agents regarding the New York Post articles before Twitter implemented the enforcement actions on October 14th, 2020, unquote. Mr. Roth, do you stand by that statement?
Yes, absolutely.
It's also worth noting that your colleague, I believe, Lauren Culbertson, told the FEC the same thing. Ms. Gaddy, did anyone from the Biden campaign or the Democratic National Committee direct Twitter to remove or take action against the New York Post story?
No.
Mr. Baker, same question to you, please.
Not to my knowledge, no.
So, the evidence is clear. Neither the Biden campaign nor the DNC had anything to do with Twitter's decision-making about the New York Post story. My Republican colleagues are using what are otherwise innocuous emails to suggest that there was somehow collusion between Twitter and the Biden campaign. For example, in one email, and this is the same one mentioned in Mr. Donald's questioning earlier, in one email selectively used by Elon Musk, one Twitter executive sends another a series of hyperlinks on October 24th, 2020, with the comment, quote, more to review from the Biden team. For the record, this is tweet number 8 in the first installment of the so-called Twitter file. So, Ms. Gaddy, are you familiar with this email?
No, I'm not.
Okay. So, just to be clear, this email has nothing to do with the New York Post story. It is dated October 24th, 2020, after Twitter had both made and reversed its decisions about the New York Post story. Mr. Baker, do I have that right?
Based on, I think, the exhibit that was shown earlier, that sounds correct, yes.
So, Ms. Gaddy, can you clarify for the record, if you're able to, what's happening here?
Can you please be more specific about?
With this email.
I don't believe I was a recipient of that email or reviewed it during my time at Twitter, so I'm sorry, I don't have familiarity with that situation.
That's okay. Mr. Baker?
To the best of my understanding, these were tweets that the campaign had concerns about. I don't know the details of those, and they were referred to Twitter as, I'm not sure exactly why, but I can't get inside their heads, but they were referred to Twitter, and Twitter reviewed them, and someone, again, going off the exhibit from earlier, said they were handled. I don't know what that means in terms of whether they took any action or didn't take any action, but at least they addressed the matter. So I believe that's what I construe from that email.
Appreciate that. So, from my understanding of everything that we've heard today, it's really not uncommon for outside entities, including, as we've heard, Mr. Trump's campaign, to request that Twitter remove content that violates the company's terms of service. Is that correct, Ms. Gaddy?
That is very common globally.
Thank you. So, to the best of your ability to answer, Ms. Gaddy, were any decisions approved or acted upon based on the political party making the request?
No, our teams were trained to enforce our rules consistently and fairly without regard to any sort of political ideology.
Thank you. So I believe that what's happening here is my Republican colleagues know that the premise of this whole hearing is misleading. There is no evidence that the Biden campaign had anything to do with the Hunter Biden New York Post story. And the evidence we do have simply shows that the Biden campaign did what the Trump campaign and millions of Twitter users do routinely: flag content and ask Twitter to conduct its own review to determine whether it violates Twitter's own rules and policies. I yield back.
Lady yield. Chair recognizes Mr. Palmer for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to submit a June 22 study conducted by Princeton University called Powered by Twitter, the Taliban's Takeover of Afghanistan.
Without objection, so ordered.
This study covers the time frame of April to September of 2021, which is 4 to 5 month period between President Biden's official announcement of America's intentions to withdraw and the chaotic end of the American troop presence in Afghanistan. The study found that the Taliban weaponized Twitter and that Twitter's moderation policies failed. There were more than 126,000 accounts in the Taliban support network, and 83% of these Taliban-associated accounts were created before 2021, well before Twitter could claim that these accounts represented a government. These accounts shared graphic images and videos depicting dead and decomposing bodies and rampantly spread disinformation about the facts on the ground in direct violation of Twitter's public policies. Taliban tweets were shared millions of times in the summer of 2020. The study also found that 3/4 of Taliban content was produced by only 20 accounts, which suggests to me that moderation efforts would have been relatively straightforward. By the way, the U.S. government classifies the Taliban as an insurgent group, in case some of my colleagues don't understand what real insurgencies are. Mr. Roth, why wasn't Twitter more effective at curtailing the clear-cut content violations by Taliban Twitter accounts?
Thank you for the question, sir. At the time that you referenced, I wasn't responsible for Twitter's work on counterterrorism.
Do you have any idea why Twitter would allow clear-cut violations by an insurgent group? And by the way, they carried out multiple suicide attacks during the time frame they were sending out these tweets, killing dozens and injuring hundreds.
Imagine that.
It's my understanding that Twitter's policies at the time distinguished between some of the more violent portions of the Taliban and some of the more political portions of it.
You
I'm not
still have
rendering
that
judgment
stuff,
on.
That stuff's still up on Twitter, and I just wonder how many content moderators were assigned, if any, to check on these accounts. Additionally, it appears that Twitter was profiting from Taliban's presence on the platform in the lead up to the overthrow of the Afghan government. Twitter placed ads from U.S. companies, including Amazon, Disney, McDonald's, and on the Twitter accounts of the Taliban news organization and their spokespersons and their senior leaders. Ms. Gaddy, did Twitter make money off placed ads on Taliban Twitter accounts on August 26, 2021, when 13 U.S. men and women died in a suicide bombing?
I have no knowledge of this matter.
You don't have any knowledge about whether or not these ads were up?
I do not.
According to Twitter, the decision to ban President Trump was after a close review of his tweets and the context around them, specifically how they are being received and interpreted on and off Twitter. On June 3rd, 2018, the Iranian Ayatollah
And we seem to have lost our signal from this live event. We will work to resolve the issue, and we hope to resume our live coverage.